Hello and welcome to The Long Shadow. How did a man who never left home become the philosopher who changed everything? Tonight we will follow Immanuel Kant from his birth in a craftsman's household to his death as the most celebrated thinker in Europe. We will watch him struggle through poverty, wait 15 years for a job he deserved, and endure a decade of silence before producing one of the most difficult and revolutionary books ever written. We will see him navigate the dangerous politics of kings and censors. We will understand why his ideas still matter, why the words he wrote in an obscure Prussian dialect still echo through our laws, our science, and our sense of what it means to be human. Before we begin this journey through the life of one of history's most extraordinary minds, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. I'm also curious. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments, and now settle in. On February 12th, 1804, in a modest house on a quiet street in Königsberg, a man lay dying who had never once left his city. He was 79 years old. His body had become frail, his once sharp eyes now clouded and dim. The room was simple, almost austere, fitting for a man who had lived his entire life according to principles of discipline and duty. A few devoted friends gathered at his bedside. Outside, the winter wind swept across the Baltic coast, the same wind that had blown through this Prussian city for the 8 decades of his existence. He had heard it every day of his life. He would hear nothing else. The physician leaned close, offering a mixture of wine and water to ease the final passage. The dying man tasted it, paused, and spoke his last words in a voice barely above a whisper. "Es ist gut," he said. "It is good." Then Immanuel Kant was gone. Consider the strangeness of what I have just described. Here was a man who never travelled more than 40 miles from the place of his birth. He never saw the ocean, though it was only a day's journey away. He never climbed a mountain. He never visited Berlin, Paris, London, or Rome. He never witnessed the great art collections of Europe, never stood in the presence of kings, or walked the halls of foreign universities that eagerly sought him. He refused every invitation, declined every opportunity to leave, and yet from this single provincial town, this harness maker's son rewrote the rules of human knowledge. He shattered assumptions that had stood for 2,000 years. He transformed how we understand the mind, morality, beauty, religion, and the very possibility of truth. His ideas would shape revolutions, inspire constitutions, and influence every major philosopher who came after him. 2 centuries later, we still think in categories he invented, even when we do not know his name. But to understand how Immanuel Kant became who he became, we cannot start with the books. We must start with the place. We must understand the world that made him, a world of strict hierarchies, devout faith, and a city that sat at the edge of European civilization. The Königsberg of Kant's childhood was not a metropolis. It was not Paris or London. But it was far from insignificant. It was a trading hub, a university town, a fortress of Lutheran piety, and the administrative capital of East Prussia. It was a city of churches and merchants, of scholars and soldiers, of rigid social order and quiet intellectual ambition. And in 1724, in a modest neighbourhood where the craftsman lived, a child was born who would never leave, and who would never need to. To understand how Immanuel Kant became the most influential philosopher of the modern age, we must first understand the world he was born into, a world of strict faith, rigid hierarchy, and a small Prussian city that would become his entire universe. Königsberg sat where the Pregel River met the Baltic Sea, a city of stone bridges and Gothic spires, of merchant ships and military garrisons. The great castle that gave the city its name, Königsberg, the King's Mountain, loomed over the skyline, a reminder that this was Prussian territory, ruled from Berlin by kings who valued order, discipline, and the Lutheran faith above all else. In 1724, the city was home to perhaps 50,000 souls. It was prosperous but not grand, cultured but not cosmopolitan. The university, founded in 1544, attracted scholars from across Protestant Europe, but it remained a provincial institution far from the great intellectual centres of the age. The streets were narrow, the winters harsh, the social order unforgiving. Everyone knew their place. At the top stood the nobility and the high officials of the Prussian state. Below them came the wealthy merchants who traded in amber, grain and timber. Then the master craftsmen, the shopkeepers, the clerks, and below them the labourers, the servants, the poor. In the neighbourhood of the saddlers, where the artisans who worked leather made their homes, lived a family of modest means and devout habits. Johann Georg Kant was a harness maker, a man who spent his days cutting and stitching leather into the equipment that horses needed to pull carriages and ploughs. It was honest work, respectable work, but it placed the family firmly in the lower ranks of the city's social hierarchy. There was no wealth here, no connections to power, no obvious path to distinction. Johann Georg had married a woman named Anna Regina Reuter, the daughter of another harness maker. They were well matched, both hard-working, both pious, both committed to raising their children in the strict traditions of their faith. They would have 9 children, though not all would survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was a constant presence in 18th century life, a shadow that hung over every cradle. On April 22nd, 1724, Anna Regina gave birth to her 4th child, a son. They named him Immanuel, a Hebrew name meaning God is with us. It was a statement of faith, a prayer embedded in a name. The family could not have known what this child would become. There was nothing in their circumstances to suggest that this particular infant, born in this particular neighbourhood, would one day be remembered when kings and generals were forgotten. The baptism took place 2 days later at the local church. The records still exist. They show an ordinary family performing an ordinary ritual, welcoming a new soul into the Christian community as their ancestors had done for generations. The baby was healthy, the parents grateful, the future unwritten. Young Immanuel would grow up in these narrow streets, surrounded by the sounds of his father's workshop and the rhythms of a working-class household. He would learn early that life required discipline, that idleness was sin, and that one's duty to God and neighbour must come before personal comfort. These were the values of his parents, the values of their community, the values that would shape everything he later thought and wrote. But the Kant household was not merely shaped by its modest trade. It was shaped by something far more powerful, a form of Christianity so intense, so demanding of moral perfection, that it would mark the young Immanuel for life. In the early 18th century, a religious movement swept through the Lutheran communities of Germany. It was called Pietism, and it transformed the faith of millions. The Pietists believed that official Lutheranism had grown cold, that the Church had become too focused on doctrine and ritual, too little concerned with the inner spiritual life. They wanted something more, a personal, emotional, transformative relationship with God. Pietism demanded constant self-examination. Believers were expected to scrutinize their own hearts, to search for sin in every thought and desire, to cultivate a moral seriousness that extended into every corner of daily life. Prayer was not just a Sunday obligation, but a constant practice. Bible study was not passive listening, but active engagement. The goal was nothing less than the complete reformation of the individual soul. Anna Regina Kant was devoted Pietist. Her faith was not casual or conventional. It was the organizing principle of her existence. She saw religious instruction as the foundation of everything her children would need to face the world. From their earliest years, she immersed them in scripture, in prayer, in the discipline of moral reflection. Young Immanuel was her particular project. She recognized something in him, a sensitivity, an intelligence, a capacity for deep thought that set him apart from his siblings. She took him on long walks through the countryside around Königsberg, using every opportunity to teach. When they looked up at the night sky, she did not simply name the stars. She explained that this vast, ordered universe was the work of God, that the same divine power that hung the stars in their courses had also placed a moral law within the human heart. These walks would stay with Kant forever. Decades later, at the end of his greatest work, he would write the words that became his epitaph. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. The echo of his mother's teaching is unmistakable. The household atmosphere was one of earnest devotion. Each day began and ended with prayer. The children memorized scripture. They were taught to examine their consciences, to confess their faults, to strive always for moral improvement. There was warmth here. Anna Regina loved her children deeply, but there was also relentless expectation. To be a good person was not enough. One must be always becoming better. This upbringing left a permanent mark on Kant. As an adult, he would move away from organized religion. He would come to distrust ritual and reject the supernatural claims of Christianity. But he never abandoned the moral seriousness that his mother had instilled. His entire philosophical project can be understood as an attempt to preserve the ethical core of pietism, the sense of absolute duty, the commitment to moral self-examination, while grounding it in reason rather than revelation. Late in his life, Kant spoke of his mother to his friends and biographers. His voice would soften, his eyes would grow distant. He called her memory sacred. He said she had planted and nurtured the first seed of good in me, and opened my heart to the impressions of nature. Whatever else he became, whatever abstractions he later developed, he never forgot the woman who first taught him to look up at the stars and wonder. Anna Regina Kant gave her son the gift of moral seriousness, but she would not live to see what he would do with it. In 1737, when Immanuel was just 13 years old, the centre of his world disappeared forever. December of 1737 was cold in Königsberg, as December always was. The Priegel River froze, the streets grew quiet, and in the Kant household, Anna Regina lay ill. We do not know precisely what took her. The medical records of 18th century harness makers' wives were not carefully preserved. What we know is that she died, and that her death shattered something in her 13-year-old son that would never fully heal. Immanuel was away at school when it happened, at the Collegium Fridericianum, the elite Pietist academy where he'd been enrolled for 5 years. Perhaps he was able to return home in time to say goodbye, perhaps not. The historical record is silent on these intimate details. What we know is the aftermath, a household without its spiritual centre, a father left to raise the surviving children alone, and a sensitive, brilliant boy suddenly cast adrift. Anna Regina had been more than a mother to Immanuel. She'd been his first teacher, his guide to the natural world, his window into the moral universe. The walks they had taken together, the conversations under the stars, the quiet moments of instruction and encouragement, all of this was now memory. At an age when most children are still forming their sense of the world, Kant lost the person who had most shaped his. How does a child process such a loss? We can only guess. Kant himself rarely spoke of his emotions in his published writings. He was famously reserved, famously controlled, famously reluctant to reveal his inner life, but the few glimpses we have are telling. When he spoke of his mother to close friends late in his life, More than 60 years after her death, his voice would change, his composure would slip. He called her memory sacred, a word he used for almost nothing else. Some biographers have suggested that this early loss explains much about Kant's adult character, his emotional distance, his reluctance to form intimate attachments, his decision never to marry. Perhaps the boy who lost his mother learned to protect himself by keeping others at arm's length. Perhaps the pain of that first great love and its sudden ending made him wary of ever loving so deeply again. This is speculation, of course. We cannot psychoanalyze the dead, but we can note the pattern. A man who valued duty over feeling, who wrote about morality with cold precision but rarely about love, who surrounded himself with friends and colleagues but kept his deepest self hidden. The roots of that pattern may lie here, in a winter in Königsberg, when a 13-year-old boy learned that the people we love most can be taken from us without warning. The household continued. Johann Georg did his best. But something irreplaceable was gone. The walks under the stars had ended. The voice that first taught Immanuel to wonder was silent. And the boy who had become the greatest philosopher of his age was left to find his own way forward. Even before his mother's death, Kant had been sent away to an institution that would test everything she had taught him, a school so severe that he would later describe his years there as something close to enslavement. In 1732, when Immanuel Kant was just 8 years old, a family friend recognized that this child was exceptional. Franz Albert Schultz was a theologian, a Pietist minister, and the director of the most rigorous school in Königsberg, the Collegium Fridericianum. He had observed young Immanuel in the Kant household and seen something unusual, a quickness of mind, a depth of attention, a capacity for learning that set the boy apart. Schultz convinced Johann Georg and Anna Regina that their son deserved an education beyond what a harness maker's household could provide. The Collegium Fridericianum was an elite Latin school designed to prepare the sons of the Prussian middle class for university and, ultimately, for careers in the church or the civil service. It offered a classical education of extraordinary rigour: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, theology, rhetoric, logic, and the ancient texts that form the foundation of European learning. For a family like the Kants, whose means were limited, securing a place at the Collegium was a significant achievement. It opened doors that would otherwise have remained firmly closed, but the school was also a Pietist institution, and Pietist education was not gentle. The day began at 5:30 in the morning with prayer. Classes followed, hour after hour, with little relief. The curriculum was dominated by religious instruction and classical languages, drilled into the students through repetition, memorization, and strict discipline. Latin was not merely studied, it was lived. Students were expected to speak it, think in it, write in it. The goal was complete fluency, the kind of mastery that would allow a scholar to read Cicero as easily as his morning newspaper. Recreation was viewed with suspicion. Play was idle, and idleness was the devil's workshop. The Pietist emphasis on moral self-examination, which Anna Regina had practiced with warmth at home, took on a harder edge at the Collegium. Students were expected to monitor not just their actions but their thoughts, to confess not just their sins but their sinful inclinations, to live in a state of constant spiritual vigilance. For a sensitive child, this could be exhausting. For a brilliant child with a questioning mind, it could be suffocating. Kant spent 8 years at the Collegium from age 8 to age 16. He excelled academically, his abilities were obvious to everyone, but he did not look back on these years with fondness. Late in life, he spoke of them with something close to bitterness. He described the experience as the slavery of youth. He resented the mechanical piety, the endless religious exercises, the suppression of natural curiosity. The school had given him an extraordinary education, but it had also made him suspicious of organised religion for the rest of his life. The irony is profound. The Collegium Fridericianum, with its Pietist intensity and its demand for moral seriousness, shaped Kant in ways that would last forever. The discipline, the rigour, the training in logic and argumentation, these became the tools of his philosophical method. The moral earnestness, stripped of its supernatural trappings, became the foundation of his ethics. The very institution that he resented also made him who he was. Yet something was missing. The Collegium taught Kant to obey, to memorize, to conform. What it did not teach him was to think for himself. That lesson would have to wait until he passed through the school's gates for the last time and entered a very different world. A world where ideas could be questioned, where authority could be challenged, and where a young man could begin, finally, to think. At 16, Kant escaped the Collegium and entered a very different world, the University of Königsberg, where ideas flowed freely and a young man could begin to think for himself. In the autumn of 1740, a 16-year-old Immanuel Kant walked through the gates of the Albertina, the University of Königsberg, and entered a world unlike anything he had known. The same year, a new king ascended the Prussian throne. Frederick II, who would later be called Frederick the Great, was a monarch of unusual interests, a patron of the arts, a correspondent of Voltaire, a man who valued intellectual inquiry over religious orthodoxy. His reign would inaugurate a period of relative openness in Prussian intellectual life, and Kant would be one of its beneficiaries. The contrast with the Collegium was immediate. Where the school had demanded conformity, the university invited inquiry. Where the school had treated doubt as sin, the university treated it as method. Students were still expected to master classical languages and Christian theology, but they were also exposed to the new philosophies and sciences that were transforming European thought. Kant enrolled as a theology student, the expected path for a poor but talented young man from a Pietist background, but his interests quickly ranged far beyond the pulpit. He discovered that he loved mathematics. He was fascinated by natural philosophy, what we would now call physics, and he found himself drawn irresistibly to the great metaphysical questions that had occupied thinkers since antiquity. What is the nature of reality? What can we know for certain? How should we live? The figure who opened these doors for Kant was a young professor named Martin Knutzen. Only 10 years older than his student, Knutzen was a rising star at the university, a man who combined deep learning with genuine enthusiasm for ideas. He introduced Kant to two intellectual traditions that would shape everything he later wrote. The first was the systematic rationalism of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and his follower Christian Wolff. These philosophers believed that human reason, properly applied, could unlock the secrets of the universe. They constructed elaborate metaphysical systems, attempting to explain everything from the nature of God to the behaviour of matter through pure logical deduction. It was a grand, ambitious, confident vision of what the human mind could achieve. The second was the empirical science of Isaac Newton. Newton's physics had revolutionized the European understanding of the natural world. He had shown that the motions of the planets, the fall of an apple, the tides of the ocean could all be explained by a single set of mathematical laws. This was not speculation or mysticism. It was knowledge, grounded in observation and confirmed by prediction. For a young man hungry for truth, Newton's achievement was intoxicating. Kant would spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile these two visions, the rationalist faith that pure reason could reach ultimate truths, and the empiricist insistence that all genuine knowledge must be grounded in experience. The tension between Leibniz and Newton, between philosophy and science, between the armchair and the laboratory, would become the engine of his thought. Under Knutsen's guidance, Kant flourished. He was a serious student, diligent and capable, but also increasingly independent. He began to develop his own ideas, his own questions, his own style of thinking. The university years were a time of intellectual awakening, a liberation from the constraints of his childhood, a discovery of possibilities he had never imagined. But the young scholar's dreams of academic life were about to be shattered by a crisis that struck at the heart of his family. In 1746, Kant's father died, and suddenly everything changed. Johann Georg Kant died in 1746. The harness maker had worked hard all his life, provided for his family as best he could, and instilled in his children the values of duty and discipline that would define his most famous son. But he had not been able to leave behind wealth. There was no inheritance, no savings, no patron to support a promising young scholar through the final years of his studies. Immanuel was 22 years old. He had not yet completed his degree, and suddenly he faced a stark reality. There was no money to continue. The path he had imagined for himself, a life of scholarship, of teaching, of pursuing ideas at the university, seemed to close before him. Königsberg was not a wealthy city, and the Kant family had no connections to the powerful. A poor student without a patron had few options. He could abandon his intellectual ambitions entirely, find some other trade, accept that his years at the university had been a pleasant interlude but nothing more, or he could find a way to survive while somehow keeping his dreams alive. This solution was common but humbling. Kant would become a Hauslehrer, a private tutor, in the households of wealthy families. It was a respectable position, better than manual labour, but it carried its own burdens. A tutor was neither servant nor equal. He lived in the household, ate at the family's table, but was always aware of his dependent status. He was paid to teach children their letters, their numbers, their Latin grammar, subjects far below the level of his own interests and abilities. And he was isolated, cut off from the intellectual community of the university, exiled to rural manor houses where the life of the mind was a luxury no one particularly valued. For a young man who had tasted the excitement of Knutsen's lectures, who had begun to develop his own philosophical ideas, who had dreamed of contributing to the great conversations of European thought, this was a bitter descent. He was not the first promising scholar to be derailed by poverty, and he would not be the last. But he had a choice to make. Would he let circumstance defeat him, or would he find a way to keep going? Kant chose to keep going. In the autumn of 1746 he left Königsberg for the Prussian countryside. He would not return for nearly a decade. The future author of the Critique of Pure Reason, the man who would reshape Western philosophy, was about to spend 9 years teaching children in rural manor houses, waiting for a chance that might never come. For nearly a decade, the future author of the Critique of Pure Reason would teach children their letters in rural manor houses. But even in exile, his mind never stopped working. The years between 1746 and 1755 are the least documented period of Kant's life. We know the outlines. He worked as a private tutor in 3 different households, all located in the countryside around Königsberg. We know the names of the families: the Anders household near Jütchen, the von Hülsen household in Arnsdorf, and the von Keyserling household near Rautenberg. Beyond that, the details are sparse. What was this life like? We can imagine it from the customs of the time and the fragments that have survived. A private tutor occupied a peculiar position. He was educated, often more educated than his employers, yet he was an employee nonetheless. He lived in the household, took his meals with the family or sometimes apart, and spent his days instructing children of varying ages and abilities. The work was repetitive, The same Latin conjugations, the same arithmetic tables, the same passages of scripture year after year. For a brilliant young man with ambitious ideas, it must have been tedious beyond measure. The countryside around Königsberg was flat and windswept, dotted with farms and manor houses. The seasons marked the rhythm of life, frozen winters when travel was difficult, brief summers when the land burst into green. The isolation was profound. There were no coffee houses where intellectuals gathered to debate, no libraries stocked with the latest publications, no colleagues with whom to test ideas. Kant was alone with his thoughts in a way that few people ever experience. Yet he did not waste these years. Every spare moment was devoted to reading and thinking. The households where he worked had libraries, and Kant devoured what he found there. He kept notebooks, jotted down ideas, worked through problems that had no immediate practical application. He was preparing himself for something, though he could not yet know exactly what. During these years, Kant wrote his first book, though he would not publish it until he returned to Königsberg. The work would deal with the physical forces of nature, the kind of natural philosophy that had fascinated him since his student days. The fact that he produced it at all, given his circumstances, testifies to an extraordinary discipline. The tutor years also taught Kant skills that would serve him later. He learned to explain difficult concepts simply, a necessity when teaching children, and a virtue that would make him a popular lecturer. He learned to observe human nature in the close quarters of domestic life, material he would later use in his writings on anthropology, and he developed the social graces that would make him, despite his humble origins, a welcome guest at the dinner tables of Königsberg's elite. The families he worked for seemed to have recognized his unusual qualities. The von Kaiserlings, in particular, remained friends with Kant long after his tutoring days were over. They saw past the role of servant teacher to the mind that lay beneath. But 9 years is a long time to wait. 9 years of teaching Latin verbs to indifferent children. 9 years of watching the academic world from the outside. 9 years of wondering whether the chance would ever come. Lesser spirits might have given up. Kant held on. In 1755 the waiting ended. In 1755 Kant finally returned to Königsberg with a completed doctoral dissertation and a bold ambition, to become a professor at the university that had once been his intellectual home. But the path would prove far longer and harder than he ever imagined. Immanuel Kant returned to Königsberg in 1755, nearly a decade after he had left. He was 31 years old. The young student who had departed with nothing but an incomplete degree and uncertain prospects now came back with something to show for his years of exile. A finished manuscript, a sharpened mind, and an undiminished ambition. His first task was to complete the formal requirements for an academic career. In April of 1755, Kant successfully defended his doctoral dissertation, a work titled A Brief Outline of Some Meditations on Fire. It was a treatise on natural philosophy, examining the physical properties of fire and heat, exactly the kind of scientific investigation that had fascinated him since his student days with Knudsen. The work was competent, learned, and unremarkable. It demonstrated that Kant could do rigorous scholarship. It did not yet hint at the revolution to come. But earning a doctorate was only the first step. To teach at a German university, a scholar needed an additional qualification, the habilitation. This required writing a second thesis, defending it publicly, and demonstrating mastery of the subject one intended to teach. In September of 1755, Kant submitted his habilitation thesis, a new elucidation of the first principles of metaphysical cognition. This work was more ambitious, engaging with the deepest questions of metaphysics, and showing a young thinker beginning to find his own voice. The thesis was accepted. Kant was now qualified to teach at the University of Königsberg. But here was the catch. He became a privatdozent, not a professor. The distinction was crucial. A professor held a salaried position, appointed by the university and paid by the state. A privatdozent held no position at all. He was merely licensed to teach. His income came entirely from the fees that students paid to attend his lectures. If no students came, he earned nothing. If the classroom was full, he might scrape by. But there was no security, no guarantee, no floor beneath which he could not fall. Kant had escaped the manor houses, but he had not yet arrived at safety. For the next 15 years, from 1755 to 1770, Kant would remain in this precarious position. He would teach constantly, sometimes as many as 20 hours of lectures per week, on an astonishing range of subjects: logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, physics, mathematics, geography, anthropology. He taught courses on the theory of fortifications. He taught courses on pyrotechnics. He taught whatever students would pay to hear, because every course fee was money he needed to survive. And through it all, he waited. He waited for a professorship to open. He watched as chairs went to other men, some more qualified, some less, some with better connections. He was offered positions at other universities, but he refused to leave Königsberg. The city that had been his whole world remained his whole world. He would have a professorship in his own university, or he would not have one at all. The waiting would test his patience to the breaking point. But Kant did not simply wait. He wrote, he taught, he thought, he published. And before he became known as a philosopher, he made his first mark on the world as something else entirely, a scientist with a radical theory about the origins of the universe. In the same year that Kant submitted his doctoral dissertation, he published a book that would have secured his reputation even if he had never written a word of philosophy. Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens appeared in 1755 when its author was just 31 years old. It was not a work of careful, cautious scholarship. It was an act of intellectual daring, a young man's attempt to explain the origin and structure of the entire universe. The central idea was breathtaking in its scope. Kant proposed that the solar system had not always existed in its current form. It had evolved. Billions of years ago, he suggested, there was only a vast rotating cloud of gas and dust, a primordial nebula spinning slowly in the void. Over immense stretches of time, gravity pulled this material together. The centre condensed into the sun. The remaining matter flattened into a disk, and within that disk planets gradually formed, each one coalescing from the swirling particles around it. This was the nebula hypothesis. Kant did not have the mathematical tools to prove it rigorously. That work would be done decades later by the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, who developed the idea independently. But the basic insight was Kant's, and it was correct. Modern planetary science still rests on the foundation he laid in that remarkable book. Yet Kant did not stop there. His imagination ranged across the cosmos. He speculated that the Milky Way was not the only collection of stars in the universe. The faint, fuzzy patches of light that astronomers had observed through their telescopes, what they called nebulae, might be other galaxies entirely, vast island universes separated from our own by unimaginable distances. This idea would not be confirmed until the 1920s, when Edwin Hubble proved that the Andromeda Nebula was indeed a separate galaxy. Kant had guessed it nearly 2 centuries earlier. He wondered about life beyond Earth. If the same physical laws operated throughout the universe, why should our planet be unique? Perhaps the other worlds orbiting our sun, and the countless worlds orbiting other suns, harboured their own forms of existence. He speculated about what such beings might be like, how their intelligence might differ from ours, how their moral development might proceed. These were questions that science fiction writers would explore 200 years later, but Kant was asking them in the age of powdered wigs and horse-drawn carriages. And he contemplated the age of the cosmos. The universe, Kant believed, was not a few thousand years old, as a literal reading of scripture suggested. It was ancient beyond human comprehension, and it was still evolving. Stars were born, lived and died. Galaxies formed and changed. The cosmos was not a static creation, but a dynamic process, unfolding across eons. Where did these ideas come from? Kant was building on the physics of Newton, applying the laws of gravity and motion to the largest questions imaginable. But he was also drawing on something deeper, the sense of cosmic wonder that his mother had instilled in him during those childhood walks under the stars. The boy who had learned to see God's hand in the heavens had become a young man who saw in those same heavens an endless frontier for scientific inquiry. The book was dedicated to Frederick the Great, the new Prussian king who represented hope for intellectual freedom. But the dedication did little good. The publisher went bankrupt shortly after publication, and most copies of the book were seized by creditors before they could be distributed. Kant's first major work sank almost without a trace. It would be rediscovered later, after Kant became famous for other reasons. Scholars would recognize it as a pioneering work of cosmology, a document that revealed a side of Kant that his dry philosophical treatises obscured. Here was a thinker who could dream on the grandest scale, who could look at the night sky and see not just beauty but a puzzle to be solved. The young scientist had shown what he could do, but the young philosopher still needed a job, and the wait for a professorship would test his patience to the breaking point. Kant was 31 years old in 1755, newly qualified to teach at the University of Königsberg, armed with a doctoral dissertation, a habilitation thesis, and a cosmological treatise that would have made any ambitious scholar proud. He had every reason to expect that a professorship would follow soon. It did not. For the next 15 years, Kant remained a privat-dozent, an unsalaried lecturer who survived entirely on the fees that students paid to attend his courses. There was no salary, no pension, no job security. If enrolment dropped, so did his income. If he fell ill and could not teach, he earned nothing. It was a precarious existence, and it stretched on year after year after year. To survive, Kant taught constantly. His course load was staggering. In a typical semester, he might offer lectures on logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, natural theology, physics, mathematics, and physical geography. He taught courses on anthropology, the study of human nature, that drew on his wide reading about distant lands and foreign customs. He even taught courses on the theory of fortifications and on pyrotechnics, subjects with military applications that attracted students preparing for careers in the Prussian army. 20 hours of lectures per week was not unusual, sometimes more. Each course represented preparation, delivery, and the hope that enough students would show up to make the effort worthwhile. It was exhausting work, but Kant threw himself into it with remarkable energy. And students did come. Kant was a popular lecturer, known for his clarity, his occasional flashes of wit, and his ability to make difficult ideas accessible. He did not read from prepared texts in a monotone, as many professors did. He spoke freely, engaged with his audience, and brought genuine enthusiasm to even the most abstract subjects. His classrooms were often full, yet the professorship he sought remained out of reach. Chairs became vacant, appointments were made, and time after time the position went to someone else. Sometimes the successful candidate was more qualified, sometimes he was simply better connected. The university was a small world, and advancement depended on politics as much as merit. Kant had no powerful patrons, no noble family to advocate for him, no connections at court. He received offers from other universities, Erlangen in 1769, Jena around the same time, but he refused them all. Königsberg was his home. It was the only place he had ever known, the only place he wanted to be. He would wait for a position in his own city, or he would have no position at all, and so he waited. He lived in rented rooms, moving from one modest lodging to another. He managed his small income carefully, never falling into debt but never achieving comfort. He watched younger men advance past him. He approached his 40th birthday, then his 45th, still a private doesn't, still waiting. By his mid-40s, Kant might have seemed like a permanent fixture of the university landscape. The brilliant lecturer who somehow never became a professor, respected but overlooked, talented but unlucky. Some men would have grown bitter, some would have given up. Kant simply continued, teaching his courses, writing his essays, developing his ideas, and waiting for the chance that might never come. While Kant waited for recognition, he developed habits so precise, so unvarying, that they became legendary. The philosopher who would systematize human reason first systematized his own life. The citizens of Königsberg could set their clocks by Immanuel Kant. Every afternoon, at precisely 3:30, the philosopher would emerge from his house on Prinzessenstrasse and begin his daily walk. He followed the same route every day, past the same buildings, at the same pace. The neighbours knew exactly when to expect him. Shopkeepers glanced up as he passed. The story spread through the city and eventually across Europe. Here was a man so regular in his habits that his afternoon walk served as the town's unofficial timepiece. This famous punctuality was not a quirk or an affectation. It was the visible manifestation of an entire system of living, designed with the same precision that Kant would later bring to his philosophical works. He rose each morning at 5 o'clock, roused by his servant with the unwavering command, "It is time." He dressed, drank his tea, always tea, never coffee in the morning, and sat down at his desk. The morning hours, from 5 until 1 in the afternoon, were devoted to writing and thinking. These were the sacred hours, protected from all interruption. During this time, Kant produced the massive philosophical works that would change Western thought. The critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, the critique of judgment, all emerged from these quiet morning sessions, accumulated page by page over years of disciplined effort. At 1 o'clock he took his single meal of the day. Kant believed that eating once was sufficient and that multiple meals burdened the digestive system. He ate well when he ate. He was no ascetic, but he ate only once. Dinner was followed by the afternoon walk, that legendary constitutional that carried him through the streets of Königsberg at 3:30 without fail. The walk served multiple purposes. It was exercise for a body that was never robust. Kant had a narrow chest, a slight frame, and a constitution that required careful management. It was also meditation time, an opportunity to think through problems, while the body moved mechanically along familiar paths. And it was a concession to the need for fresh air, which Kant believed was essential to health. He breathed only through his nose during these walks, keeping his mouth firmly closed, convinced that this prevented illness. After the walk came the social hours. Most evenings Kant either entertained guests at his own table or dined at the homes of friends. These were not brief encounters. Dinner conversation might continue for hours, ranging across every topic imaginable: politics, science, literature, travel, the nature of human beings. Kant was a celebrated conversationalist, witty and engaged. Nothing like the dry academic his philosophical prose might suggest. But by 10 o'clock he was home. Always by 10, and shortly after he was in bed, the day's cycle complete, ready to begin again at 5 the next morning. The discipline was extraordinary, but it was not arbitrary. Kant's health was fragile. He suffered from a weak constitution, chronic digestive troubles, and what seems to have been a tendency toward hypochondria. The rigid routine was his way of managing a body that could not be taken for granted. By controlling everything that could be controlled, when he woke, when he ate, when he walked, when he slept, he could maximize his productive hours and minimize the unpredictability of illness. Only twice, according to legend, did Kant miss his afternoon walk. Once was when he received his copy of Rousseau's Exile and became so absorbed in reading that he forgot the time entirely. The other was when news arrived of the French Revolution, an event so momentous that even the Clockwork Philosopher was thrown off schedule. These exceptions only proved the rule. For decades the schedule held, and within that schedule Kant accomplished more than most people achieve in several lifetimes. But this solitary clockwork existence concealed a rich inner life, and a social world that many who know only Kant's reputation for dry abstraction would find surprising. The image of Kant as a reclusive hermit, locked away with his books and his thoughts, is one of the great misconceptions in the history of philosophy. In truth, Kant was deeply social. He loved conversation. He sought out company. He was a regular presence at the dinner tables of Königsberg's elite, and he hosted gatherings at his own table with genuine pleasure. For a man who never travelled, who never saw the wider world, the dinner party was the window through which he observed humanity. Kant had a rule about the proper number of guests, more than the Graces but fewer than the Muses. In Greek mythology, there were 3 Graces and 9 Muses, so Kant's ideal dinner party included between 4 and 8 people, counting himself. Fewer than 4 made conversation too limited. More than 8 made it unwieldy. At the right size, discussion could flow freely, touching on every subject, allowing each guest to contribute without anyone dominating. The topics ranged widely. Politics was a favourite, though Kant was careful, especially in later years, when censorship became a real threat. Science was discussed, literature reviewed, gossip exchanged. Kant particularly enjoyed hearing about foreign lands, about the customs and geographies of places he had never seen and would never visit. He asked detailed questions. He remembered everything. Visitors who had actually travelled were sometimes astonished by how much this provincial philosopher knew about their own countries. His closest friend was an English merchant named Joseph Green, who had settled in Königsberg and established a successful trading business. Green shared Kant's passion for punctuality. He was perhaps the only person in the city whose daily habits were as precise as the philosopher's. The 2 men dined together regularly, their friendship based on mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and a shared appreciation for order. When Green died in 1786, Kant was devastated. He had lost one of the few people who truly understood him. There were other friends, other regular companions at the dinner table. The physician Marcus Hertz, who became an important correspondent. The theologian Johann Georg Hamann, whose mystical Christianity stood in stark contrast to Kant's rationalism. Various academics, merchants, and officials who made up the cultivated society of a provincial capital. Kant moved easily among them, charming and engaged, a far cry from the stereotype of the unworldly philosopher. He was also attentive to his appearance. In his younger years he dressed fashionably, even elegantly, a surprise to those who imagine him in the drab garments of a scholar. He wore wigs, as was the custom of the time. He carried a sword, as gentlemen did. He paid attention to the social niceties, understood the importance of presentation, and conducted himself with the manners of a man who belonged in polite society, even though his origins were humble. And yet he never left. He never travelled to Berlin to meet the king. He never visited the great universities that would have welcomed him. He never saw the Alps, the Mediterranean, the cities that his books discussed with such apparent familiarity. He learned about the world through reading, through conversation, through the reports of those who'd been there. He absorbed it all, synthesized it, and became, in his way, one of the most cosmopolitan minds in Europe without ever leaving home. The paradox is striking. Here was a man who thought in universal terms, who developed a moral philosophy based on the dignity of all human beings everywhere, who proposed perpetual peace among nations, and who never set foot outside a single Prussian city. Perhaps the limitation was also a liberation. Perhaps staying in one place allowed him to think thoughts that constant travel would have interrupted. Yet beneath the pleasant routines and dinner conversations, a crisis was building in Kant's mind, a crisis triggered by a Scottish philosopher who would, in Kant's own words, awaken him from his dogmatic slumber. David Hume was a problem. The Scottish philosopher, born in 1711, had published his most radical ideas decades before Kant encountered them. But ideas travel slowly, and it was not until the 1760s that Hume's work began to trouble the mind of the Königsberg lecturer. When it did, the effect was shattering. Hume was an empiricist. He believed that all human knowledge comes from experience, from what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. There are no innate ideas, no truths built into the mind from birth. We start as blank slates, and everything we know is written on us by the world outside. This sounds reasonable enough. But Hume pushed the logic to disturbing conclusions. Consider causation. We believe that one thing causes another. The fire causes the water to boil. The ball causes the window to break. But what do we actually observe? We see the fire, and then we see the water boiling. We see the ball strike the window, and then we see the glass shatter. We never see the causation itself. We see one event, then another. We assume a connection, but that connection is not given in experience. It is something we add. And if causation is merely a habit of the mind, not a feature of reality, then the foundations of science begin to crumble. Science depends on the assumption that causes produce effects reliably, that what happened in the past will happen again in the future. But this assumption cannot be proven by experience, since experience only tells us what has happened, not what will happen. We believe the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every day before. But logically, that is not proof. It is merely expectation. Hume called this the problem of induction, and he concluded that certainty is impossible. We can have probable beliefs based on past experience, but we can never have knowledge in the strict sense. The world we think we understand might behave completely differently tomorrow. We have no rational guarantee that it will not. When Kant finally absorbed the full force of Hume's argument, he was devastated. For years, Kant had been a follower of the rationalist tradition, the philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff that he had learned from his mentor Knudsen. This tradition taught that human reason could discover necessary truths about the world, truths that held with logical certainty. Mathematics was the model. The Pythagorean theorem was not merely probable, but necessarily true. The rationalists believed that similar certainty could be achieved in metaphysics, in our understanding of God, the soul, and the ultimate nature of reality. Hume demolished this confidence. If all knowledge comes from experience and experience can never yield certainty, then the entire rationalist project was built on sand. The grand metaphysical systems were castles in the air. Even science, the great achievement of Newton and his successors, rested on foundations that could not bear the weight. Kant later wrote that Hume had interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a completely different direction. The comfortable assumptions were gone. The old answers no longer worked. Something new had to be built. But what? How could one save science from Hume's skepticism? How could one preserve the possibility of genuine knowledge while acknowledging the limits that Hume had exposed? These questions would haunt Kant for the next 2 decades. They would drive him to construct an entirely new philosophical system, the most ambitious attempt to answer Hume that anyone had ever made. But the solution did not come easily, and before Kant could find it, another thinker would reshape his understanding of human beings themselves. Hume shattered Kant's confidence, but another thinker would give him something equally powerful, a new vision of human dignity that would reshape his moral philosophy forever. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was unlike any philosopher Kant had encountered. The Genevan writer was wild where the Germans were systematic, passionate where they were precise, unpredictable where they were methodical. His life was a scandal. He had abandoned his own children to foundling homes, quarrelled with virtually everyone who tried to help him, and wandered across Europe in a state of perpetual persecution, real and imagined. His prose burned with emotion, his ideas were dangerous, and he transformed Immanuel Kant. Before reading Rousseau, Kant later admitted, he'd been an intellectual snob. He valued learning, prized the cultivation of the mind, and looked down on those who lacked education. The common people, the farmers, the craftsmen, the labourers, seemed to him less worthy of respect than the scholars and scientists who pursued knowledge. The life of the mind was the highest life. Those who did not share it were, in some sense, lesser beings. Rousseau shattered this prejudice. In Emile, his revolutionary treatise on education published in 1762, Rousseau argued that the natural goodness of human beings was corrupted by society. Children were born innocent. Civilization made them vicious. The elaborate structures of learning and refinement that Kant so admired were, in Rousseau's view, often instruments of corruption rather than improvement. More importantly, Rousseau insisted that every human being, regardless of education, regardless of social standing, regardless of intellectual achievement, possessed an inherent dignity that could not be taken away. The peasant was not worth less than the professor. The serving girl was not beneath the noblewoman. All human beings were equal in their fundamental moral worth. This was a revelation. Kant encountered Emile shortly after its publication, and the book seized him completely. Legend has it that he was so absorbed in reading it that he missed his famous afternoon walk, one of only 2 occasions in his life when this happened. The story may be exaggerated, but the impact was real. Kant emerged from the encounter with Rousseau a changed man. "I am myself by inclination a seeker after truth," Kant wrote. "I felt a consuming thirst for knowledge and a restless passion to advance in it, as well as satisfaction in every step of progress. There was a time when I thought that this alone could constitute the honour of mankind, and I despised the common people who know nothing. Rousseau set me right. This blind prejudice vanished. I learned to respect humanity." The transformation was visible in Kant's study. The only decorative image he permitted himself was a portrait of Rousseau, hanging on the wall where he could see it as he worked. Not Newton, whom he admired as a scientist. Not Leibniz, whose philosophy had shaped his early thinking. Rousseau, the wild man, the outsider, the prophet of human equality. The influence went deep. When Kant later developed his moral philosophy, the central principle would be that every human being must be treated as an end in themselves, never merely as a means to someone else's purposes. This was Rousseau's insight, transformed by Kant's systematic rigour into a philosophical principle. The categorical imperative, the supreme law of morality, was, in a sense, Rousseau's passion filtered through Kant's reason. Kant also absorbed Rousseau's political ideas, the notion that legitimate government must rest on the consent of the governed, that laws must apply equally to all. that freedom is the birthright of every human being. These ideas, which would fuel revolutions in America and France, found their way into Kant's political philosophy as well. The Königsberg professor who never travelled had found in the Genevan wanderer a kindred spirit. Both believed in the power of ideas to transform the world, both believed in the dignity of the individual, and both, in their different ways, would help create the modern world. Armed with the challenge of Hume and the moral vision of Rousseau, Kant was now prepared to build something new. But first, at age 46, he would finally receive the recognition he had sought for so long. In 1770, after 15 years of waiting, Immanuel Kant finally received the appointment he had sought for so long. The chair of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg had become vacant. Kant, now 46 years old, was the obvious candidate. He had been teaching these subjects as a privat docent for a decade and a half. His lectures were popular, his publications respected, his reputation growing. There was no one in Königsberg better qualified for the position. This time, the appointment came through. On March 31st, 1770, Kant became a full professor at the university that had been his intellectual home since childhood. The wandering was over. The precarious years of living on student fees were finished. For the first time in his adult life, Kant had a guaranteed salary, job security, and the official recognition of the Prussian academic establishment. The occasion was marked by his inaugural dissertation on the form and principles of the sensible and intelligible world. This was not a mere formality. The dissertation was a substantial philosophical work, and it already contained the seeds of the revolution that was to come. In this work, Kant began to distinguish between the world as we experience it through our senses and the world as it might be in itself, independent of our experience. He argued that space and time are not features of reality, but forms of human perception, the frameworks through which we organize our sensory experience. This was a radical claim, and it pointed toward the central insight of the critique of pure reason, still a decade away. Colleagues took notice. The dissertation circulated among philosophers across Germany. Some were intrigued, others were puzzled. What exactly was Kant claiming, and where was he going with these strange ideas? The answer would take years to emerge. For now, Kant settled into the life of a professor. His teaching load was substantial but manageable. His income was sufficient for modest comfort. He moved into better lodgings. He continued his social rounds, his dinner parties, his famous walks. The external circumstances of his life had finally stabilized. But internally, something momentous was happening. The questions that Hume had raised, the vision that Rousseau had inspired, the problems with the rationalist tradition that Kant had absorbed in his youth, all of this was coming together in his mind, demanding a comprehensive solution. He was not content to write a dissertation and rest on his laurels. He was preparing for something much larger. The professorship was not an ending. It was the beginning of the most productive and consequential phase of Kant's career. With his financial worries behind him, he could finally devote his full attention to the project that had been building in his mind for years. What followed was the strangest decade of Kant's career, a decade in which this prolific writer published almost nothing. The silence was not idleness. It was preparation for an earthquake. Between 1770 and 1781, Immanuel Kant virtually disappeared from the philosophical scene. This was strange. Before his professorship, Kant had been a prolific writer. Essays, dissertations, reviews, lectures, a steady stream of publications had established his reputation. Colleagues expected that the security of a full professorship would only increase his output. Instead, it seemed to dry up entirely. Year after year passed with no new major work. Friends inquired politely. Students wondered. The philosophical community began to forget about the Königsberg professor who'd shown such promise. Whatever happened to Kant? Had he run out of ideas? Had success made him lazy? Had he simply decided that teaching was enough? What they could not see was the invisible labour. Kant was not idle during these years. He was wrestling with the most difficult problem he had ever faced, and perhaps the most difficult problem in the history of philosophy. How could human knowledge be possible at all? Hume had shown that experience alone could not yield certainty. The rationalists had claimed that reason alone could discover necessary truths. But pure reason, unsupported by experience, seemed to spin empty fantasies, metaphysical systems that could not be verified or tested. Neither approach worked on its own. Something new was needed. Kant's solution, which he was slowly constructing through the 1770s, was a synthesis. He would argue that knowledge requires both experience and reason, working together in a specific way. The mind does not passively receive impressions from the world. It actively organises them according to structures that are built into the very nature of human cognition. Space and time, he realised, are not features of reality itself, but forms of human perception. We cannot experience anything except in space and time, because that is how our minds are constituted. Similarly, concepts like causation, substance, and unity are not discovered in experience, but imposed on it by the understanding. The world we know is a world we have partly constructed. This was the famous Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had shown that the apparent motion of the stars was actually caused by the motion of the Earth, Kant showed that the apparent structure of the world was partly a contribution of the observing mind. We do not simply conform our thoughts to objects. Objects conform to our thoughts, but working out the details was agonizing. Kant wrote and rewrote. He developed elaborate arguments, then discovered flaws and started over. He filled notebooks with drafts, outlines, fragments. He approached the problem from multiple angles, seeking the right framework, the right terminology, the right structure. He despaired. He pushed on. The years accumulated. 1771, 72, 73. Still no book. 74, 75, 76. Kant turned 50, then 51, then 52. Still no book. Colleagues assumed he had given up. He had not. Finally, in 1780, Kant began writing in earnest. The ideas had crystallized. The structure was clear. He wrote feverishly, pouring out the massive work that had been building for a decade. He worked through the spring, through the summer, into the fall. Page after page accumulated. By early 1781, it was done. After 10 years of invisible labour, Kant finally completed his masterwork. In 1781, at the age of 57, he published a book that would transform Western philosophy forever. In May of 1781, a book appeared from a small publisher in Riga. Its title was forbidding, Critique of Pure Reason. Its length was intimidating, over 800 pages of dense philosophical argument. Its author was a 57-year-old professor from Königsberg who had published almost nothing in a decade. No one knew what to expect. What they received was one of the most important and difficult books ever written. Kant himself had no illusions about its accessibility. In the preface, he acknowledged that the work was dry, obscure, contrary to all ordinary ideas, and on top of that prolix. He was not trying to be popular, he was trying to be correct. And the problem he was addressing was so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the nature of human thought, that no easy treatment was possible. The central question of the critique is deceptively simple. What can we know? The answer is revolutionary. Kant argued that the human mind is not a passive receiver of information from the outside world. It is an active organizer of experience. When we perceive the world, we do not simply record what is there. We impose structures on our experience, structures that come from the mind itself. Consider space and time. We experience everything as being located in space and occurring in time. But Kant argued that space and time are not features of reality independent of us. They are forms of human intuition, the framework through which we organize our sensory experience. We cannot perceive anything except in space and time because that is how our minds work. A mind constructed differently might organize experience differently, but for human beings, space and time are inescapable. Similarly with causation, we believe that every event has a cause, but as Hume had shown, we never directly observe causation, only sequences of events. Kant's solution was to argue that causation is a category of the understanding, a concept that the mind brings to experience rather than discovering in it. We do not learn from experience that every event has a cause. We could not have coherent experience at all unless we organized it according to causal principles. This leads to a profound distinction between two kinds of reality: the world as it appears to us and the world as it is in itself. The world as it appears, the phenomenal world, is structured by space, time, and the categories of the understanding. This is the world we experience, the world that science investigates, the world of everyday life. About this world we can have genuine knowledge, but beyond the phenomenal world lies the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world. This is reality independent of human perception, reality stripped of the structures our minds impose. And about this world, Kant argued, we can know nothing. It lies forever beyond the reach of human experience and human reason. This conclusion had radical implications. Traditional metaphysics had claimed to know things about God, the soul, and the universe as a whole, things that transcended experience. Kant argued that such claims were meaningless. We cannot know whether God exists, whether the soul is immortal, whether the universe had a beginning. These questions lie beyond the limits of human reason. They are not false exactly. They are simply unanswerable. In one stroke, Kant had both saved science and demolished metaphysics. Science could proceed confidently, knowing that its methods yielded genuine knowledge of the phenomenal world. But the metaphysical claims of the rationalists and the dogmatic assertions of traditional religion were shown to be beyond proof. It was, as later thinkers would recognize, one of the most important books in the history of human thought. Kant had spent 10 years writing his masterpiece. Now came the reception, and it was not what he had hoped. The critique of pure reason landed in the intellectual world of 1781 like a stone dropped into deep water. At first, there was barely a ripple. Kant had expected controversy. He had not expected incomprehension. The first reviews trickled in, and they were discouraging. Reviewers complained that the book was unreadable. They accused Kant of excessive abstraction, of inventing unnecessary terminology, of losing himself in distinctions that no one else could follow. One early review, published anonymously in a Göttingen journal, was particularly damaging. It compared Kant's work to the idealism of George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher who had argued that only minds and ideas exist, that the material world is an illusion. This comparison infuriated Kant. Berkeley was a subjective idealist, someone who denied the reality of the external world. Kant was trying to do the opposite, to explain how we can have genuine knowledge of an external world within certain limits. The reviewer had not understood the book at all, but the misunderstanding was widespread. Readers who had been trained in the rationalist tradition of Leibniz and Wolff found Kant's arguments disorienting. Readers who sympathized with Hume's empiricism thought Kant had not properly answered the skeptical challenge. Everyone agreed that the book was difficult. Few agreed on what it actually said. The sales were slow. Philosophers who might have engaged with the work put it aside, defeated by its length and obscurity. Kant's decade of effort seemed destined for oblivion. He was frustrated, even bitter. In private letters, he complained about the stupidity of his critics, the superficiality of the reviews, the failure of the learned world to recognise what he had achieved. He had solved the deepest problems in philosophy, and nobody seemed to notice. His response was practical. In 1783 he published a new work, Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that will be able to present itself as a science. This was not a summary of the critique, but a kind of guidebook to it. A shorter, clearer presentation of the main ideas, written in a more accessible style. Kant hoped it would help readers understand what he'd accomplished. It did. Slowly the tide began to turn. Younger philosophers, less wedded to the old system, started to engage seriously with Kant's ideas. Study groups formed at German universities. Disciples emerged, eager to work out the implications of the new philosophy. The term Kantian began to appear in print. By the mid-1780s, Kant was becoming famous. Not universally understood, he would never be that, but recognised as a major thinker who had done something genuinely new. The Critique of Pure Reason was on its way to becoming one of the foundational texts of modern philosophy. But Kant was not finished. The first critique had addressed knowledge, what we can know about the world. Now he turned to a different question, one that had haunted him since childhood, since those walks with his mother under the stars. The Critique of Pure Reason was about knowledge, what we can know. But Kant was equally concerned with a different question, one that had haunted him since childhood. What should we do? The question that haunted Kant was as old as philosophy itself. What makes an action right? For centuries, thinkers had offered answers. Some said that right actions are those that produce good consequences, happiness, pleasure, the welfare of society. Others said that morality comes from God's commands, revealed in Scripture and enforced by the threat of divine punishment. Still others grounded ethics in human feelings, sympathy, benevolence, the natural sentiments that draw us toward kindness and away from cruelty. Kant rejected all of these approaches. Consequences, he argued, are unreliable guides to morality. We cannot always predict the results of our actions. A well-intentioned deed might lead to disaster. A selfish act might accidentally produce good. If morality depends on outcomes, then we can never know whether we have acted rightly until after the fact, and even then we might be wrong. This seemed to Kant a shaky foundation for something as important as ethics. Divine commands posed a different problem. Even if God exists and has issued moral laws, we must still use our own reason to determine what those laws are and whether they are truly good. The mere fact that God commands something does not make it right, unless God's commands are themselves grounded in reason. And if they are grounded in reason, then reason, not God, is the ultimate source of morality. As for feelings, Kant was deeply suspicious. Emotions come and go. Sympathy waxes and wanes. One person feels compassion for strangers, another feels nothing. If morality depends on sentiment, then moral obligations would vary from person to person, moment to moment. There would be no universal moral law, only shifting preferences. Kant wanted something more solid. He wanted a morality grounded in reason alone, a morality that would be binding on every rational being, regardless of their feelings, their circumstances, or their particular desires. He wanted, in short, a moral law as universal and necessary as the laws of mathematics. The result was the categorical imperative. In 1785, Kant published the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, where he first formulated this supreme principle of morality. The categorical imperative is not a specific rule. Do not lie, do not steal, but a test for determining whether any proposed action is morally permissible. The first formulation is this: act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, before you act, ask yourself, what if everyone did this? What if the principle behind my action were adopted by all rational beings? If the result would be contradictory or self-defeating, then the action is wrong. Consider lying. If everyone lied whenever it suited them, the very concept of truth would collapse. No one would believe anyone, and lying itself would become pointless. The practice of deception depends on a background assumption of honesty, an assumption that universal lying would destroy. Therefore, lying fails the test of the categorical imperative. The second formulation approaches the same idea from a different angle. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This is Rousseau's insight transformed into philosophical principle. Every human being possesses inherent dignity. To use someone merely as a tool for your own purposes, to deceive them, exploit them, or manipulate them without regard for their own goals and values, is to violate that dignity. Morality requires that we respect the autonomy of every rational being, including ourselves. 3 years later, in 1788, Kant published the Critique of Practical Reason, extending and deepening these ideas. Here he argued that moral obligation is not something imposed on us from outside. It arises from our own rational nature. When we act morally, we are not submitting to an external authority but expressing our highest freedom, the freedom to govern ourselves according to laws we give to ourselves through reason. This was a profound shift. Morality was no longer about obedience but about autonomy. The moral law was not a burden but an expression of human dignity. The echoes of Kant's Pietist upbringing are unmistakable. The emphasis on duty, the demand for moral rigour, the insistence that right action must be done for its own sake and not for reward. All of this recalls the household where young Immanuel learned to examine his conscience and strive for moral perfection. But Kant had stripped away the supernatural framework. The moral law no longer required God's authority. It was written in reason itself. Kant had explained what we can know and what we should do. But his system was not yet complete. There remained the realm of human feeling, aesthetic experience, and the sense of purpose in nature. In 1790, Kant published the work that completed his philosophical system, the Critique of Judgment. The first critique had examined theoretical reason, what we can know about the world. The second had examined practical reason, what we ought to do. Now Kant turned to a faculty that seemed to lie between them, the power of judgment, particularly as it operates in our experience of beauty and our understanding of living things. The book is divided into 2 parts, and both address questions that the previous critiques had left unanswered. The first part deals with aesthetic judgment. What happens when we call something beautiful? Is beauty merely subjective, a matter of personal taste, with no claim on anyone else? Or is there something more to it? Kant's answer was characteristically subtle. Beauty is not a property of objects in the way that size or colour might be. When we judge something beautiful, we're not making a claim about the world that could be verified by scientific investigation. And yet aesthetic judgments are not merely expressions of personal preference either. When I say that a sunset is beautiful, I'm not just reporting that I happen to like it. I'm claiming that others should find it beautiful too, that there is something about the experience that makes it shareable, even universal. Kant located this universality in the structure of the human mind. When we experience beauty, he argued, our faculties of imagination and understanding enter into a special kind of harmony. The imagination presents the object to us in all its sensory richness. The understanding grasps it conceptually. In ordinary experience, these faculties work together toward a specific purpose, identifying objects, solving problems, navigating the world. But in the experience of beauty, they play freely, without a definite goal. This free play produces pleasure, a pleasure that we expect other human beings who share our cognitive structure to feel as well. The beautiful for Kant is thus a meeting point between the subjective and the objective. It is not arbitrary, but neither is it provable. It reveals something about the harmony between the human mind and the world, a harmony that cannot be explained but can be felt. The second part of the critique addresses teleological judgment, our tendency to see purposes in nature. When we look at a living organism, we naturally think of it as designed for something. The eye seems made for seeing, the heart seems made for pumping. But can we really attribute purposes to nature? Can we say that nature intends anything? Kant was careful here. He didn't claim that nature actually has purposes in the way that human beings do. That would be a metaphysical assertion going beyond what we can know. But he argued that we are justified in thinking about nature as if it had purposes, especially when we try to understand organic life. The parts of an organism are so intricately related, so mutually dependent, that we cannot comprehend them without reference to the whole. This is not a scientific discovery, but a regulative principle, a way of organizing our inquiry. The third critique was immediately influential, particularly among the young romantics who were beginning to reshape German culture. Poets and philosophers seized on Kant's ideas about beauty, the free play of imagination, and the purposiveness of nature. The philosopher Friedrich Schelling, the poet Friedrich Schiller, and countless others found in Kant's final critique a bridge between cold rationalism and the warmth of aesthetic experience. By 1790, Kant was the most famous philosopher in Europe. But fame brought danger. Revolutionary ideas were spreading from France, and the Prussian authorities were watching. On July 14th, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille in Paris, and the world changed forever. The French Revolution announced itself with promises of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. It swept away an ancient monarchy, abolished feudal privileges, and proclaimed that sovereignty belonged to the people. For intellectuals across Europe, it was an exhilarating moment. The Enlightenment made flesh, reason triumphing over tradition, humanity asserting its dignity against centuries of oppression. Kant watched from Königsberg with intense interest. He had already declared his allegiance to Enlightenment principles. In 1784, he had published a short essay titled An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? The piece became one of his most famous works, not for its philosophical technicality, but for its ringing clarity. Enlightenment, Kant wrote, is humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. It is self-imposed when its cause lies not in any lack of understanding, but in a lack of courage. The motto of Enlightenment, Kant declared, is sapere aude, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own reason. This was a revolutionary statement, even before the revolution. It challenged every form of authority that demanded obedience without justification. Religious authorities who told people what to believe, political authorities who told people how to live, intellectual authorities who discouraged independent thought. Kant was calling on human beings to think for themselves, to question received wisdom, to accept no claim on trust alone. When the revolution erupted in France, Kant saw it as the practical realization of these ideals. Here was a nation throwing off the chains of arbitrary power, asserting the autonomy that he had made the centrepiece of his moral philosophy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in August 1789, enshrined principles that Kant had been developing for years, that all men are born free and equal, that the purpose of government is to protect natural rights, that law must express the general will. Many intellectuals who initially welcomed the revolution later recoiled in horror. The execution of the king in 1793, the reign of terror that followed, the spectacle of a revolution devouring its own children, all of this drove former sympathisers into opposition. Edmund Burke denounced the revolution as a catastrophe. Former radicals recanted. Kant did not. He deplored the excesses, certainly. The violence troubled him. But he never abandoned his conviction that the principles of the revolution were sound, even if the execution was flawed. The problem was not the ideals of liberty and equality. The problem was the failure to realise them properly. A revolution that betrayed its own principles was still preferable, in Kant's view, to a tyranny that never had any principles to betray. This was a dangerous position to hold. Prussia was a monarchy, and the Prussian king had no interest in seeing revolutionary ideas spread to his own subjects. The authorities were watching, censorship was tightening, and Kant, the most famous philosopher in Germany, was known to harbour sympathies that the Crown found alarming. In 1793, Kant published a book that went too far, and the full weight of royal censorship came crashing down upon him. The book was called Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, and it was everything the Prussian authorities feared. Kant had always been careful about religion. He knew it was dangerous territory. But the logic of his philosophical system led him inevitably to questions about God, morality, and the foundations of faith. In the first critique, he had argued that we cannot prove God's existence through theoretical reason, but neither can we disprove it. In the second critique, he had suggested that belief in God is a practical necessity for moral life, even if it cannot be theoretically demonstrated. Now, in 1793, he attempted a comprehensive examination of religion through the lens of reason alone. The argument was subtle but explosive. Kant distinguished between religion as a set of moral principles, which he endorsed, and religion as a system of rituals, dogmas, and supernatural beliefs, which he subjected to withering criticism. True religion, he argued, is nothing other than morality viewed under the aspect of divine command. The moral law is binding because it is rational, not because God enforces it. If religious doctrines conflict with morality, then so much the worse for the doctrines. This was not atheism. Kant believed in God, or at least believed that we are justified in acting as if God exists. But his God was a moral God, known through practical reason rather than revelation. The Bible was valuable insofar as it taught moral truths. Its historical and supernatural claims were secondary at best. The elaborate theology of the Lutheran Church, with its doctrines of original sin, vicarious atonement, and miraculous intervention, was either reinterpreted beyond recognition or quietly set aside. The reaction was swift. Frederick the Great, the enlightened monarch who had protected intellectual freedom, had died in 1786. His successor, Frederick William II, was a different kind of ruler. He was pious in a conventional way, suspicious of philosophical innovation, and determined to enforce religious orthodoxy. His minister Johann Christoph von Wellner had already issued edicts restricting freedom of thought and strengthening censorship. The first parts of Kant's book had slipped past the censors in Berlin. They were deemed too abstract to be dangerous. But when the full work appeared, the authorities recognized the threat. This was not obscure metaphysics. This was an attack on the foundations of established religion, written by the most prestigious philosopher in Germany. In October of 1794, Kant received a letter bearing the royal seal. The king himself had written, or at least signed, a stern rebuke. Kant was accused of misusing his philosophy to distort and disparage many of the cardinal and basic teachings of the Holy Scriptures and of Christianity. He was warned that continued disobedience would bring unpleasant measures. He was ordered to cease lecturing and writing on religious subjects. Kant was 70 years old. He had spent his entire career at the University of Königsberg, dependent on royal favour for his position. He could have been dismissed, disgraced, perhaps worse. The threat was real. His response was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity. He wrote to the king acknowledging the royal displeasure. He declared that, as your majesty's most loyal subject, he would henceforth refrain from all public pronouncements on religion, whether in lectures or in writings. The key words were, as your majesty's most loyal subject. Kant was not promising unconditional silence. He was promising silence during the reign of this particular king. The obligation was personal, not permanent. Frederick William II died in November of 1797. Kant immediately considered himself released from his promise. He resumed writing on religion, though by then his health was failing and his productive years were behind him. He had outlasted his senses, but he could not outlast time itself. As the new century approached, the great philosopher's body and mind began to fail. The final years of Immanuel Kant's life were marked by a slow and painful diminishment. By the late 1790s, the philosopher who had once walked with clockwork precision could barely make it around the block. The eyes that had read thousands of books now struggled to focus on a single page. The memory that had held an entire philosophical system now sometimes failed to recall the names of old friends. In 1796, Kant delivered his last lecture at the University of Königsberg. He was 72 years old, and the effort of teaching had become too much. The classroom where he had held forth for 4 decades would know his voice no more. He retreated to his study, surrounded by the books and papers that had been his life's companions. He was not idle. He could not be idle, even now. He worked on a final philosophical project, an attempt to bridge the gap between the critique of pure reason and his philosophy of nature. Scholars would later call this work the opus posthumum, though Kant never completed it or gave it a title. Fragments accumulated, ideas half-developed, arguments trailing off into silence. The systematic rigour that had characterised his published works was increasingly beyond his grasp. Friends and former students visited when they could. Some found him lucid, able to discuss philosophy and recall old times. Others found him confused, struggling to follow the thread of conversation, occasionally mistaking the present for the distant past. The decline was uneven, punctuated by moments of startling clarity, but the overall trajectory was unmistakable. His daily routine, once so precise, became simpler and shorter. The famous afternoon walks ceased. The dinner parties grew rare, then stopped entirely. The circle of companions shrank as old friends died, and Kant became less able to maintain relationships. A servant named Martin Lamper had been with Kant for decades, a loyal but difficult man whom Kant eventually dismissed after a quarrel. The separation was painful. Kant wrote himself notes to remember not to think about Lamper, a poignant testament to the philosopher's awareness of his own mental decline. A new servant, Johann Kaufmann, and later Kant's sister's family, helped care for him in his final years. He required assistance with basic tasks. The man who had prized his independence above almost everything else was now dependent on others for the most ordinary activities of daily life. Yet dignity remained. Kant never lost his fundamental courtesy, his sense of propriety, his respect for the people around him. He might not remember their names, but he treated them with consideration. The moral law that he had articulated so rigorously still governed his conduct, even as the rational powers that had discovered it were fading. The winter of 1803 was hard. Kant weakened visibly. He ate little and spoke less. Those who saw him knew that the end was approaching. On February 12th, 1804, the waiting ended. Immanuel Kant took his last breath in the city where he had spent every day of his nearly 80 years. The morning of February 12th, 1804, came grey and cold to Königsberg. In the house on Prinzessinstrasse, Immanuel Kant lay in bed, his strength nearly exhausted. He'd been fading for months, eating almost nothing, speaking in fragments, drifting in and out of awareness. The physician who attended him, Dr. Wilhelm Gottlieb Kelker, had done what he could, but there was nothing to be done. The body that had carried one of history's greatest minds was simply worn out. A few devoted friends kept watch. The philosopher's final days had been quiet, marked by long silences and occasional murmured words. He was not in apparent pain. That was some comfort, but he was clearly approaching the end. Sometime that morning, Dr. Kelker offered Kant a mixture of wine and water, perhaps to ease his passing, perhaps simply out of the habits of care. Kant, barely able to speak, tasted the liquid. He paused, as if considering it. Then, with great effort, he spoke his final words. Es ist gut. It is good. What did he mean? Was he approving the wine, expressing satisfaction with his life, offering a final judgment on existence itself? No one knows. The words admit of many interpretations, and Kant was not there to explain. Shortly after speaking them, he lost consciousness. By 11 o'clock in the morning he was gone. He was 79 years old. He had lived his entire life in a single city, never travelling more than a few hours from the place of his birth. He had never married, never had children, never held political office, never commanded armies or accumulated wealth. By the standards of the world, his life had been extraordinarily limited, and yet the news of his passing travelled across Europe like a shockwave. The funeral, held on February 28th, drew thousands of mourners. The academic community of Königsberg turned out in force, along with civic officials, military officers, students, and ordinary citizens who understood, even if they could not explain, that something important had been lost. The coffin was carried through streets lined with silent crowds. Church bells tolled. The philosopher, who had questioned every assumption, including the assumptions of religion, received the full honours of a Christian burial. He was laid to rest in the Cathedral of Königsberg, beside the city's other distinguished dead. A simple marker identified the grave. In later years, a more elaborate monument would be erected, inscribed with the words from the Critique of Practical Reason that had become his epitaph: "The starry heavens above me, and the moral law within me." The man who never left his hometown had conquered the world, not through force or wealth, but through ideas. Ideas so powerful that they would reshape philosophy, politics, religion, and science for centuries to come. Immanuel Kant was gone. But the revolution he'd started was just beginning. Within a decade of Kant's death, the philosophical landscape of Europe had been transformed. A new generation of thinkers, raised on the critiques, was pushing Kant's ideas in directions he might not have anticipated or approved. The movement that came to be called German idealism emerged directly from engagement with Kantian philosophy, accepting its premises and then radically extending them. Johann Gottlieb Fichte was the first. He had been one of Kant's most devoted followers, and his earliest work was so Kantian that readers initially assumed the master himself had written it. But Fichte grew dissatisfied with what he saw as an inconsistency in Kant's system. If the thing in itself, the world as it exists independent of our experience, is truly unknowable, why should we believe it exists at all? Fichte proposed to eliminate it entirely, arguing that all reality is ultimately the product of the self's own activity. The world is not given to us, we construct it. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling took a different path. Trained in theology and fascinated by nature, Schelling sought to reunite the subjective and objective sides of Kant's philosophy. He developed a philosophy of nature that saw the material world not as dead matter, but as the visible expression of an underlying spiritual reality. Art, not science, was the highest form of knowledge, because art alone could capture the unity of subject and object. And then there was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the greatest and most controversial of the post-Kantian thinkers. Hegel absorbed Kant's framework but rejected its limitations. Where Kant had drawn careful boundaries around what reason could know, Hegel proclaimed that reason knows no boundaries. Reality is ultimately rational, and the history of the world is the progressive self-realization of spirit, unfolding through contradiction and synthesis toward absolute knowledge. It was a vision of breathtaking ambition, and Kant, who had spent his career warning against just such metaphysical overreach, would almost certainly have disapproved. Yet even Hegel was responding to Kant, working through Kant, unable to escape the conceptual framework that the Königsberg professor had established. Every German philosopher of the 19th century stood in Kant's shadow, whether as disciple or critic. The influence spread beyond the academy. The romantic poets and artists who flourished in the decades after Kant's death drew deeply on his ideas, particularly the Third Critique, with its analysis of beauty, genius, and the creative imagination. Friedrich Schiller wrote philosophical letters inspired by Kant's aesthetics. Samuel Taylor Coleridge brought Kantian ideas to England, where they influenced an entire generation of literary thinkers. Kant's moral philosophy became the foundation for what philosophers now call deontological ethics, the view that morality is about duty and principle rather than consequences. Every subsequent debate about the nature of ethics has had to contend with the categorical imperative and its implications. His political philosophy, with its emphasis on individual rights, constitutional government, and the possibility of perpetual peace, fed into the liberal tradition that reshaped European politics over the following century. The revolutions of 1848, the movements for national self-determination, the slow spread of democratic governance, all of these drew, consciously or not, on ideas that Kant had articulated. By the middle of the 19th century, a rallying cry emerged among philosophers dissatisfied with the speculative excesses of Hegel and his followers, back to Kant. The neo-Kantian movement that resulted would dominate German philosophy for decades, insisting on the importance of epistemology, the limits of metaphysics, and the critical method that Kant had pioneered. But Kant's influence was not confined to philosophy departments. His ideas shaped the world we live in today. Walk into the United Nations headquarters in New York, and you will find, inscribed in the halls of power, a concept that Immanuel Kant articulated more than 2 centuries ago: human dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, rests on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity. This is not a scientific claim that can be proved by experiment. It is a moral commitment, a decision to treat every person as possessing inherent worth that cannot be taken away. The language echoes Kant as categorical imperative. Treat humanity, in your own person and in that of others, always as an end and never merely as a means. The institutions of international cooperation that emerged from the wreckage of 2 world wars, the League of Nations, the United Nations, the European Union, all reflect another Kantian idea. In 1795, Kant published a short work called Toward Perpetual Peace, in which he outlined the conditions for lasting peace among nations, He proposed a federation of free states bound by common principles, respecting each other's sovereignty while working together to prevent war. It was a vision that seemed utopian at the time. It seems less so today. The distinction Kant drew between phenomena and noumena, between the world as we experience it and the world as it might be in itself, continues to shape how we think about the limits of knowledge. Scientists who acknowledge that their theories are models, not final truths, are working within a broadly Kantian framework. Philosophers who distinguish between what we can know and what we can only believe are applying distinctions that Kant first made rigorous. Cognitive science, the interdisciplinary study of the mind, owes more to Kant than many of its practitioners realize. The idea that the mind actively structures experience, that perception is not passive reception, but active construction, is a Kantian idea. When researchers study how the brain organizes sensory information into coherent objects and categories, they are investigating the mechanisms behind what Kant called the synthesis of intuitions. Even in everyday moral reasoning, Kantian patterns of thought are pervasive. When we ask ourselves, what if everyone did this? When we test our actions against a standard of universal applicability, we're thinking in Kantian terms. When we object to being manipulated or used, when we insist on being treated with respect, when we demand that our autonomy be recognized, we are invoking principles that Kant articulated with unmatched clarity. The man who never travelled has travelled everywhere. His ideas have crossed oceans, shaped constitutions, influenced movements for civil rights and human dignity. He's present in courtrooms where judges invoke human rights, in classrooms where students debate ethical dilemmas, in laboratories where scientists reflect on the foundations of their method. Kant would have found all of this deeply gratifying, and perhaps a little alarming. He believed in human progress, in the gradual improvement of mankind through the exercise of reason. He would have celebrated the spread of constitutional government and the articulation of universal rights. But he would also have insisted, as he always insisted, on the limits of reason, on the importance of humility, on the danger of claiming to know more than we can. And so, our journey comes to an end, with a final reflection on the man who never travelled but changed everything. Immanuel Kant lies buried in Kaliningrad, the Russian city that was once called Königsberg. The cathedral where his tomb rests has survived wars and revolutions, neglect and restoration. Outside its walls, the city has changed beyond recognition. The medieval streets where Kant took his afternoon walks were destroyed in the Second World War. The castle that gave the city its name is gone. The university where he taught for decades has been replaced by a Russian institution bearing a different name. Almost nothing remains of the physical world that Kant inhabited, and yet, in a deeper sense, his world has never been more present. The ideas he developed in that small Prussian city have become part of the intellectual air we breathe. We cannot escape them any more than we can escape the structure of our own minds. Consider the paradoxes of his life. He never travelled, yet his thoughts reached every corner of the globe. He never married, yet he understood the demands of human relationships with profound insight. He lived by rigid routine, yet he championed freedom as the highest human value. He was a provincial, yet he thought in universal terms. He was modest in his circumstances, yet ambitious beyond measure in his ideas. The epitaph on his tomb captures something essential. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. These are not random observations. They represent the two poles of Kant's entire philosophy: the external world of nature, ordered by laws that human reason can discover, and the internal world of morality, governed by laws that human reason can give to itself. The starry heavens are sublime because they dwarf us. reminding us of our insignificance in the cosmic order. The moral law is sublime because it elevates us, revealing our dignity as rational beings capable of acting on principle. Kant showed us that we are not merely objects in the universe, buffeted by forces beyond our control. We are also subjects, agents capable of reason, choice, and moral commitment. We can ask what is true and seek to discover it. We can ask what is right and strive to do it. We can ask what is beautiful and learn to appreciate it. These capacities set us apart. They make us responsible for ourselves and for each other. He also showed us the limits of what we can know. The thing in itself, the ultimate nature of reality, lies forever beyond our grasp. This might seem like a defeat, but Kant saw it as a liberation. By acknowledging what we cannot know, we clear space for what we must believe, for faith, hope, and the practical commitments that make a meaningful life possible. If this journey through Kant's life has given you something to think about, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I would love to know which of Kant's ideas resonates most with you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Immanuel Kant lies in Königsberg, now called Kaliningrad, far from the great cities where his ideas took root. But his shadow reaches across centuries. He taught us that the greatest journeys are not measured in miles, but in the depth of thought. He showed us that within every human mind lies a universe as vast as the starry heavens above, and he reminded us that the moral law within is not a burden, but a gift, the gift of being truly, irreducibly human. Gute Nacht, good night.